If a face can become famous without a person becoming known, Albert Delègue is one of the clearest examples. In the early 1990s, his image moved through European fashion with unusual speed. Armani fragrance ads, luxury campaigns, a Vogue France portrait by Mario Testino, and the small circle of male models who briefly had names the public might recognize. He came from Marilhaud in the Hautes-Pyrénées, where he had worked as a ski instructor, far from the Paris machinery that turned him into an emblem of expensive male beauty. Then, in 1994, he vanished from the industry. In April 1995, his family gave one explanation for his death. Within days, French newspapers printed another. What survived was the image. What nearly disappeared was the man. The supermodel decade is remembered mostly through women, and that memory is fair. Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Cindy Crawford, and their peers became cultural figures at a level no male model of the period truly matched. They moved into music videos, television, interviews, gossip columns, and contracts that became part of fashion mythology. Men worked in a narrower lane. The early 1990s still opened a rare space for male models. Luxury brands began using certain male faces as repeatable commercial symbols, borrowing a language they had already built around female beauty. For a few years, a small group of men occupied that space. Their names now feel more obscure, yet fashion press at the time treated them as a visible tier. Trusted for major campaigns, known enough to appear by name instead of disappearing into catalogs. Albert Delègue belonged to that group. A 1995 French book on fashion's new stars listed Greg, Cameron, Werner, Albert among the men who had conquered the media. Later retrospectives placed him beside Marcus Schenkenberg, Cameron Alborzian, Werner Schreier, Greg Hansen, and Elaine Gossuin. These were the men fashion could identify, book repeatedly, and package as part of a new male model moment. Delègue's visibility came mainly from advertising. He walked runway, and a Daniel Hector booking from the Paris Spring-Summer 1993 men's collections confirms he worked there as well. His commercial strength came from print campaigns, fragrance imagery, and magazine pages. Runway leaves behind seasons, designers, and video traces. Advertising from that era often survives in less stable forms: scans, stock captions, private collections, and memories of images once seen everywhere. A billboard can cover a city for weeks, then disappear under new paper. Vogue France published a Mario Testino portrait of Delègue in 1990, placing him early in his career before one of the decade's defining photographers. By the peak of his Armani work, he had entered the campaign world of houses tied to European luxury at its most polished: Armani, Calvin Klein, Versace, Valentino, Kenzo, Sonia Rykiel, Chevignon. For several years, fashion used his face as proof that male beauty could sell beyond the runway. He became useful to the industry in the cleanest commercial sense: recognizable, expensive, repeatable. Then the record around him thinned with startling speed. The public trail becomes uneven here. Delègue was visible enough for major publications and brands to use him, yet his visibility came through objects built for short lives: ads, seasonal pages, product campaigns, and press mentions tied to a campaign cycle. The same system that made him familiar left future viewers with few stable places to find him. This makes the opening contrast clearer. He entered the record through images before viewers had real language for the person behind them. Albert Delègue grew up in Marilhaud, a small commune in the Hautes-Pyrénées near Bagnères-de-Bigorre. Local press later called him l'enfant du pays, the local son. The phrase placed him in a real community before fashion turned him into a face that could appear anywhere. That local beginning also keeps the later glamour from floating too far away from the ground. Before the contracts, he was still attached to a place where people knew his family name without needing a campaign credit. Some records give Rambouillet as his birthplace, while French-language references tie him strongly to Marilhaud. His childhood and local memory belong to Marilhaud, and that is where the clearest thread begins. Before Paris, before the campaigns, before Armani, he was known through a small village in the Pyrenean foothills. His father, Jacques Delègue, was identified in family-linked sources as a retired general practitioner and former director of a preventorium near Bagnères-de-Bigorre. His mother, Maja, was an artisan ceramicist. Later material describes her as having Portuguese roots. The clearer picture is a rural professional household outside fashion, entertainment, and Paris agency networks. Before modeling, he worked as a ski instructor. Local accounts also connect him to mountain and water sports, including snowboard, surf, and ski nautique. That background shaped his body and his ease with movement, but it gave him no formal entrance into fashion. He was 26, already an adult by modeling standards, still tied to slopes, water, and sport when his life changed. One regional profile says he had begun a technical degree in computing before moving towards ski instruction. It remains a small detail, but it fits the broader outline of a young man building a life far from the teenage scouting pipeline that usually supplied agencies. His route into modeling was late, unexpected, and outside the normal system. The usual French modeling path in the late 1980s ran through open calls, teenage discovery, and early agency development. Delègue came from somewhere else entirely. He had no documented runway training, no known fashion connections, and no long apprenticeship in front of photographers. He arrived in Paris with a life already built elsewhere. That beginning gives the later image a different weight. The Armani fragrance face had recently been a ski instructor from the Pyrenean foothills. The polished campaign figure came from a place where professional life followed weather, terrain, and physical skill. Fashion often rewrites that kind of origin into destiny. Delègue's start looked closer to chance, timing, and a face the industry immediately knew how to use. In 1989, Delègue arrived in Paris and was introduced to Olivier Bertrand of Success Models. The meeting did not come through a formal casting line or the usual agency process. It came through someone close enough to the agency for Bertrand to see him, and Bertrand recognized the potential immediately. Delègue signed with Success Models soon after. 2 days later, he already had a major contract. The first significant campaign attached to that moment was for Parfums Bourjois, the job that pushed him into the industry at speed. He was 26, entering a field where many models had already spent years building a book, learning the camera, and waiting for a client to take a serious chance. The speed of signing tells you how hungry the market had become. Agencies were no longer only filling clothes. They were looking for men who could carry money and adult confidence in a single frame. A fragrance campaign could do what runway could not. It placed a face in magazines, retail spaces, and repeated advertising cycles. The model could remain personally unknown while the image became familiar. Viewers only had to connect the face with desire, money, and polish. Delègue entered at the right moment. By the early 1990s, luxury brands were expanding male aspiration as a commercial category. Female supermodels had already shown how profitable a recognizable face could become. The male side had fewer fixed rules, so the right face could move quickly when a brand believed it could carry the image. His age gave him a different presence. He looked adult, composed, and physically complete. Fragrance advertising had little use for boyishness. It needed a man who could make expensive restraint look natural. Delègue offered that without years of visible industry shaping. The speed still stands out. A standard path would have meant test shoots, smaller bookings, agency patience, and slow trust from clients. His path compressed that into days. His face arrived at the same time the market was looking for men who could sell luxury with the same force women had already brought to fashion. Success Models gave him the machinery. Advertising gave him the acceleration. Once he entered that circuit, his face could move between clients with unusual speed. Agencies sold the look. Brands supplied the repetition. Delègue became useful before the industry had even built a public biography around him. A few years earlier, a male model from outside fashion might have stayed local or drifted through small jobs. In 1989, Success Models had clients looking for men who could make luxury feel modern. Delègue fit the brief before anyone had time to polish the story around him. Giorgio Armani became the center of Delègue's career. From roughly 1991 through the end of his active working life, he appeared as the face of Armani fragrance advertising across European magazines. That work gave him a level of visibility few male models reached at the time. El País later put the Armani contract at 5 million French francs, about 760,000 euros, across the years he worked with the house. For a male model in that period, the figure was unusually large. Female supermodels still commanded the louder headlines and the larger mythology, but Delègue's Armani deal placed him in a different category from the usual campaign face. The Armani image was controlled and precise. Delègue's face sold masculinity as calm, expensive, and physically assured. The photographs avoided dirt, chaos, and strain. They gave the viewer elegance without biography. The man in the image looked healthy, remote, and composed, which made him ideal for fragrance advertising. That visual identity matched the luxury mood of the period. Fragrance campaigns sold very little practical information. They sold distance. A body became a sign for status and desire. Delègue carried that image cleanly, and Armani used him at a scale that made his face familiar across borders. The Armani years gave that search its clearest answer. Delègue did not need a loud public persona, because the campaign supplied the atmosphere around him. Beyond Armani, his name appears in connection with Calvin Klein, Valentino, Versace, Kenzo, Sonia Rykiel, Chevignon, Daniel Hector, Morgan, Iceberg, and René Lazare. Some credits survive more clearly than others, but the larger picture holds. Delègue was working across the major luxury and fashion landscape of the early 1990s. Vogue France published his Mario Testino portrait in 1990. Later credits connect him to Bruce Weber for a 1992 Armani cologne image and Herb Ritts for Versace in 1991, though those trails are harder to pin down from public archives. What can be seen clearly is the level of work around him. Delègue was being placed where fashion was sharpening its idea of male beauty for mass luxury advertising. Armani remains the anchor. Campaign work made Delègue visible beyond runway's reach. His face could appear in several countries over months and years, attached to a product that sat close to the body and promised a version of adult male elegance. That was the fantasy being sold. The cost of that kind of fame was anonymities inside visibility. Viewers knew the face before they knew the man. They could recognize the campaign without knowing Marilho, Jacques, and Maja, the ski instructor years, or the illness that would later become part of the public record. Advertising made him visible and strangely thin at the same time. That silence becomes sharper beside the scale of the Armani work. A fragrance contract can make a person unavoidable while revealing almost nothing about him. The public sees the finished surface, never the negotiations, the family pressure, the private fear, or the illness that the image was never built to hold. Delègue's career sits inside a small male model cohort that formed in the early 1990s. Marcus Schenkenberg, Cameron Alborzian, Greg Hansen, Werner Schreier, Alain Goswin, and Delègue kept appearing in the same fashion conversations. Mark Vanderloo belongs to the broader generation as well. Schenkenberg became the best known internationally, but Delègue worked in the same professional terrain during his active years. Their fame had a narrow shape. These men appeared in campaigns, magazines, and television programs. They were visible enough to be named, packaged, and compared. At the same time, they never reached the cultural saturation of the female supermodels. The public knew the women's personalities and scandals. The men remained closer to images with names attached. That distinction keeps Delègue's place in proportion. He was one of the prominent male models of his era, especially within the success model circle of the early 1990s. He belonged to the upper tier of men working in luxury fashion, without a clean public ranking that places him above everyone else. The power of the story comes from his visibility, not from forcing him into a title no archive can fully prove. One unusual artifact from this period shows how that male cohort was being presented. In March 1994, a charity single titled TLC, Tender Loving Carcasse, appeared under the name Enfant de Bosnie à l'abri. Music VF records the release, and Discogs matches the participant list. Delègue appeared with Alain Goswin, Cameron Alborzian, Greg Hansen, Werner Schreier, and a singer named Chris Martin. The single responded to the Bosnian War. It was not a major chart event or a famous celebrity campaign. Its importance comes from the way these men were used publicly. They had enough identity beyond the photo studio for a humanitarian record to place their names beside a cause. For male models in that period, that level of collective visibility was rare. The timing gives the detail more weight. March 1994 places Delègue still inside the public male model circle. He was active, named, and grouped with peers. Within months, he would be absent from the industry, and the public explanation for that absence would center on an accident. In August 1994, Delègue suffered what was publicly described as a serious water sport accident. Accounts vary between ski nautique and moto aquatique. Later English retellings often turn this into an alpine skiing crash, likely because he had worked as a ski instructor, and because the translation flattened over time. The original frame was a water sport accident. After that summer, his professional visibility dropped. A man who had been working at the peak of his commercial career no longer appeared in bookings, campaigns, or public fashion activity in the same way. The accident explained the absence. Serious injury can end a modeling career, especially when the job depends so heavily on the body. By 1994, that public face was already established, which made the silence around his absence easier to overlook. Viewers had been trained to recognize the image, not ask after the man. His family first attributed his death to complications from the August accident. French press reports soon identified AIDS-related illness as the cause. The surviving record does not show that every detail of the accident account was invented. It shows that the first public explanation differed from what French newspapers then placed on record. The accident account also made sense inside the culture of 1995. AIDS carried intense stigma in France, including within fashion. A 1992 Los Angeles Times report described AIDS in Paris fashion circles as almost taboo. People knew losses privately, while public naming remained rare. The same report described a French media culture reluctant to identify AIDS status after death, even when rumors were widespread. France was facing a severe epidemic. The 1992 coverage cited more than 14,000 AIDS deaths and an estimated 200 people living with HIV. Public fear remained high. CNRS's history of AIDS in France traces the hostile early framing of the disease, including the gay cancer label, and the stigma attached to people associated with the epidemic. Effective combination therapy arrived in 1996, a year after Delègue died. In that climate, disclosure carried consequences. AIDS could become a public judgment, especially for someone whose work depended on beauty, health, and desirability. Delègue's commercial image had no room for visible illness. Armani's photographs presented a man who looked controlled, untouched, and expensive. Illness broke that frame in a way the luxury industry had no interest in displaying. The accident story needed no formal conspiracy. Grief, fear, stigma, and a less damaging explanation were enough. It gave the family a public version that sounded familiar, and it gave the fashion world a version it could accept without looking too closely. During his active years, Delègue appeared on a French television program where the host made a contemptuous remark about men who showed weakness, then added a homophobic insult as the audience applauded. El País later revisited the clip. The moment says nothing about Delègue's sexuality, and the story should not speculate there. It shows the atmosphere around masculinity, public cruelty, and casual homophobia in the era. That was the world surrounding his silence. The family account belongs in that world. Grief under pressure, privacy under stigma, and a public explanation that softened the truth before French newspapers printed a harder one. Albert Delègue died at Perpignan Hospital in Toulouse on the 14th of April 1995. He was 31, though some press reports at the time called him 32. Either way, he died in his early 30s, after a career that had lasted only about 5 years. Le Monde described him as Armani's star model and reported his death from Toulouse. Local press later remembered him as the top model from Marilho. His death was covered in both national and regional press, but the first explanation for it did not hold for long. His family's first public account linked his death to complications from the previous August's accident. That was the version people saw in the days immediately after he died. It gave the public a tragic explanation without naming AIDS. 5 days later, L'Humanité published a brief note stating that Delègue had died of AIDS at Perpignan Hospital. Le Monde also identified AIDS as the cause. The French gay magazine Idol later gave a more specific cause, encephalitis resulting from HIV. El País described his death as encephalitis that developed as a complication of the AIDS virus, and wrote that the news shook the fashion and advertising worlds. French newspapers corrected the story within days and weeks. Outside France, the correction never traveled with the same force. Later English summaries and casual retellings kept returning to the accident version, sometimes turning the original water sport accident into a skiing accident. Alain Gossin spoke about the episode years later. In a 2010 interview, he said a television segment where he confirmed that Delègue had died of AIDS was removed after Delègue's family intervened. That memory fits the pattern around the story. The truth surfaced, then met resistance from people who were still trying to protect the version they had given publicly. A French press item from April 21, 1995 has been cited as saying Armani would stop using Delègue's image. The full article and any direct statement from Armani are hard to access now. What remains is the silence around it. The brand had built a fragrance image around his face, and after his death, there was no widely available public acknowledgement of the AIDS dimension. The episode does not need to turn anyone into a villain. His family was grieving under stigma. Journalists corrected the cause. The fashion industry moved on. The harder truth is that a fact can appear in the newspaper and still fail to become part of how a person is remembered. Albert Delègue faded from the wider fashion world, but the people closest to his home kept his name alive. His parents, Jacques and Maja, remained in Marilho, and Paris Match photographed them there in 1996. In 1999, TF1 aired a saga segment about him. Local Memory produced a Trophée Albert Delègue. An association Fondation Albert Delègue was created in Marilho to help young people from the area enter professional life. His parents also published a memorial book in October 1995. That legacy stayed local, practical, and personal. It preserved him through family, place, and work rather than through fashion mythology. The foundation was not built around perfume campaigns or famous photographers. It attached his name to young people trying to find a path into working life. Fashion kept far less. Getty Images surfaces only a small number of indexed Delègue items, and several are photographs of his parents rather than fashion images of Albert himself. His campaign work survives scattered scans, collector traces, encyclopedia entries, and later retrospectives. His name appears with and without the accent, Delègue and Delègue. each spelling cohort in a different direction. The language barrier adds another layer. Much of the strongest material is French or Spanish. English language fashion coverage gives him far less space than his career suggests he earned. He now has English and French Wikipedia pages, but they rest on a narrow trail of sources. They exist because people went looking for him and pieced together what they could find. The forgetting did not come from one place. Male model history received far less archival attention than the female supermodel era. AIDS stigma shaped the first public accounts of his death. Local remembrance stayed close to family and region. Campaign archives from that period remain incomplete or hard to reach. Fashion as an industry moved on to new faces. Trying to follow him now means moving through fragments, a magazine's scans, a Spanish article, a local reference from the Pyrenees, a music database entry, a cemetery record, a television memory. The face once circulated widely, but the person has to be rebuilt from pieces. Mirillo kept a different memory. La Dépêche later described him as magnifique et simple. The phrase lands differently from a local paper than it would from a brand. It speaks to someone remembered by the place he came from, rather than a face preserved because it once sold a product. That divide shapes his afterlife. Fashion made him visible on a large scale and left behind fragments. His home region had less power to broadcast him, but it kept his name attached to a life beyond campaigns. Albert Delègue's career lasted about 5 years. A short career can still leave a long shadow, especially when the images were designed to outlive the season. His face moved through fashion faster than his name ever did, and that imbalance shaped everything that came after. Early 1990s fashion can look almost sealed from a distance. Glossy campaigns, famous photographers, perfect bodies, names that still carry glamour. Delègue breaks that surface. The face in the advertisement belonged to a man with parents, a hometown, a life before modeling, an illness, and a death people struggled to name plainly. The accident explanation gave the public a version of events that fit more easily inside the image, already built around him. A sports injury could be tragic without threatening the fantasy. AIDS did something else. It brought stigma, fear, and the fragile reality of the body into a world that had sold him as composed, healthy, and untouched. That is where the Armani image becomes harder to look at. The photographs were never meant to carry ordinary life. They were built to sell distance, elegance, and control. Most advertising works that way. It removes context until a person becomes a surface. Delègue's death forced the missing context back into view. The French press named AIDS-related illness within days, but that correction never traveled as widely as the campaigns had. The image had crossed borders with ease. The truth moved more slowly. In French articles, later Spanish retrospectives, local memory, and scattered traces people had to search for on purpose. His family kept him close. Mirillo kept his name attached to something practical and human. Fashion kept far less, a face, a few credits, fragments of campaigns, and the strange quiet that follows when an industry moves on before memory can settle. That is why his story still carries weight. Albert Delègue was turned into a public image before the public ever knew him as a person. When the person became impossible to fit inside that image, the image remained easier to keep than the full story behind it. Albert Delègue's career was brief, but it left a trace through the commercial fashion that defined the early 1990s. His face belonged to the moment when luxury brands were learning how to sell male beauty with the same confidence they had already built around women. For a few years, he was one of the men chosen to carry that image. Then the image outlived the person behind it. Fashion could make him look controlled, healthy, expensive, and untouchable. It had far less room for the life attached to that face. The village in the Hautes-Pyrénées, the parents who kept his memory close, the illness that arrived in a climate of fear, and the death that first reached the public through an easier explanation. French newspapers named AIDS-related illness quickly. The wider fashion world did far less with that truth. His campaigns kept their polish, but his story broke into fragments. French articles, Spanish retrospectives, local memory, old scans, and the people who kept searching after the industry moved on. His parents built something in his name. Mirillo remembered him as more than a campaign face. Fashion kept the surface for a while, then let it fade. The place he came from held on to the man.